Well, hello and welcome to the latest episode of the Making Lean Fly podcast. This one's really exciting. This is the first one where we've got external guests, and the podcast subject is the psychology of change. It's an interesting subject, and that's why we've invited two august external guests for this, David Bovis and Levent Turk, and I'll ask them to introduce themselves in a moment. But the abstract for this episode is that change is something that human beings are constantly experiencing from our cradle to the grave in both our personal and professional lives. Organisations in both the public and private sectors are constantly reinventing themselves, and it would be almost unheard of to find an organisation of any scale that doesn't have at least one significant change or what they might call a transformation programme ongoing. However, the way that we experience and respond to change isn't something that can be logically planned for or easily predicted, as the psychology of change goes to the very root of our being as humans and involves functions of the brain that evolved millions of years ago and that still cannot be fully explained by science. So in this episode, our guests discuss what makes change fail and what leaders can do to better understand the function of the brain and how to adopt a people focus that can make their change goals a success. So as I said, we've got some great guests on this show. First one I want to introduce is David Bovis. He's the inventor, the creator of the model called BTFA, Believe, Think, Feel and Act, sometimes called the Bovis cycle. And this complements and works interactively with what a lot of people know as the Shewhart or Deming cycle of PDCA. And I'm a true believer. So welcome, David. Great to have you on the show.
Hi, Philip. Nice to be here. Thanks very much for inviting us on.
Yeah, you're absolutely welcome. And the second guest we have is Levent Turk. He's David's business partner and brings a really practical and pragmatic approach to change and the psychology behind it. So welcome, Levent. Great to have you on the show.
Thanh you, Philip.
Great.
Thanks for inviting us.
Absolutely, it's great to have you on board. And finally, we've got our usual furniture here. We've got Edwin. Great. Joking aside, Edwin, great to have you on the show. You always bring a fantastic perspective to this.
Thanks, Philip. It's a privilege to be here, and especially with David and Levent as our external guests. It's brilliant. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely welcome. So let's start with those introductions. So, David, could you give us a brief introduction to yourself? Tell us a little bit about yourself, your background.
Yeah, of course. I'm 35 years in industry, man and boy. Started off in an apprenticeship, got bored, went to a different apprenticeship to become a toolmaker. Worked from shop floor to top floor in various roles as engineer and production engineer. Ended up progressing through different businesses to general manager and director. Got tasked with turnaround by some CEOs on a couple of different places. And ended up as a consultant leading change in professional services. So that kind of experience over those years has given me an opportunity to work in a lot of different sectors. So automotive, aerospace, space, defence, covering a lot of disciplines really: material handling, extrusion, injection molding, high precision engineering, that kind of stuff. But I normally sum it up by saying I've done everything from hydrogen fuel cells to quarrying 12-ton lumps of stone and pretty much everything in between. So yeah, that's it for me. I mean, along the way, I read a lot on psychology and philosophy and neuroscience. So
great. Well, I mean, fantastic background. Although you did use the C word, David.
What's the
consultant?
Why do you think I'm not one anymore?
Great. Thank you, David. And Levent, love to hear a brief introduction of yourself as well.
Yes, sure. I started my professional life as a research and development engineer, and after 5 years, I joined Toyota. I started to work in Takoka plant of Toyota in Japan. I worked there for 2 years. The objective was to learn Toyota production system, then to establish a greenfield plant in Turkey. We did that, and during the following 14 years, I've been in positions like production general manager, quality general manager, engineering general manager, and purchasing general manager. Finally, I was the president of Toyota Motor Europe's Turkey branch. Then I changed my job, started working in another automotive OEM called Karsan, where we were producing Renault trucks, Hyundai trucks, and Peugeot Citroën car-derived vehicles under contract manufacturing model. I led production there. Then the following 9 years, I worked for MAN Bus and Trucks as a board member in charge of production. Then I was retired for the last year. I've been giving consultancy to automotive manufacturers, and we are working with David together on BTFA.
Brilliant, brilliant. And I think the audience, the listeners, will probably know what I mean by august guests when you hear the background of Levent and David. And I also the one thing I will say, Levent, having watched the BTFA course videos a number of times, when you speak now, I cannot help but picture you as a cartoon character. And anybody who has had the privilege of watching or seeing the BTFA course will know what I mean when they do see it. And then Edwin, I think most listeners know you by now, but just a very brief reminder of who you are.
Thanks, Philip. Edwin van den Berg. I worked in industry since 1997, so I was just calculating. That's close to 26 years now, out of which probably 20 years I've been involved in Lean and Six Sigma in different roles, from the shop floor through improvement management and quality management. And now I have the privilege to lead the Lean Academy and develop our Lean Excellence model and our curriculum-based learning for GKN Aerospace. It's a privilege to be doing that, and it's a privilege to also have the opportunity to be amongst the first who get to process the psychology of change as part of their learning curriculum. And indeed, the alter egos that David and Levent have in their course materials, they stick with you forever. It's really fun to watch. It's also great learning, and I'm happy to be using that learning in our curriculum in GKN. So,
yeah,
thank you.
Completely agree, Edwin. And I think it was a stroke of genius for you to use your own voices in the training. Cartoon characters, because it as Edwin does, it creates alter egos for the two of you, which really works well. So listen, let's get into the subject. So I think the first thing is, what is the psychology of change? That's the first question. And before I go to the real experts, I'm going to put you on the spot, Edwin. And you're developing the training course for us in GKN Aerospace. So what have you learned so far? What is the psychology of change?
Well, I've needed some time to really digest it, but what to me it comes down to is the combination of psychology and making things different, making things better. Psychology is all around what happens in our brains, how our feelings and emotions work, and how that influences the way we behave and act. And of course, when you go through change, what we're looking for is improvement, things getting better, basically seeing that, observing that by how you change the way you act. So these things of mental processes, of emotions and feelings, and how they interact with the way we act and the way we can absorb and drive change, to me, is the description of psychology of change. Still very high level. I think there's a lot to do to understand it better and then use it, but that would be my definition.
Thank you, Edwin. I think that's really good. It certainly spoke to me. So thank you. I think great definition. Levent, what would be your view of what the psychology of change is?
Yeah, I completely agree with Edwin's definition. If we simply define psychology as a method or a way to understand why people behave the way they do, then psychology of change is perhaps to understand what's happening in brain when change is happening outside. I can simply put it like this.
Absolutely, thank you, Levent. And then David, finally to you, what's your view of this? What's your definition?
Yeah, as you'd expect, not different from the others. I think psychology aims to explain why people behave as they do, and we've got 30 years in change environments in industry around the planet, and that's allowed us to see people's behaviour and how people react when consultants, that C word again, come in to try and change bases, and new projects get introduced by boards of directors. And we found, there's a lot of subjectivity in the language, and we needed to perhaps get a bit further. So we introduced the neuroscience as well to give us that baseline language, which really makes the psychology more clear. So for us, the psychology of change is understanding people making change in a change environment, but also introducing brain function to make it easier to understand the psychology, because psychology is full of very strange terms. But something Edwin said triggered another thought in my mind, which is, it's all about continuous improvement, and historically the world's been focused on continuous improvement of process. But that phrase that came from Toyota, I think, we build people before we build cars, moved me 25 years ago when I first heard it. And I think this is about, if we make people better, then organizations get better. And for me, that's really what psychology change is about. It's about focusing on the improvement of people and giving them a better quality of life in our work environments.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I love that. But what was triggered by me? We keep using that term, triggered. What triggered me and what you said, David, was, you started using words like neuroscience, and we're talking about psychology. We're talking about the way brains work. Can be quite scary, right? It can be quite off-putting. Why, as a business leader who's very busy already, why should I care about this neuroscience? Why should I want to know about the psychology of the brain? Surely I just want to get something done. I get the team together, we decide what we're going to do, and then we just go do it, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I guess the question is, and this is a question that we were talking to a chap out in South Africa recently, and he said, do you employ people? And obviously the answer is yes. And do those people have a brain between their ears? And the answer is yes. And say, well, how else do they do anything you want to get them to do? Whether it's follow a process or invent a new one, they've got to engage that brain. So if we don't understand how the brain responds and reacts, especially when it's trying to survive, or it's scared or stressed or anything else, and how that can detract from getting the job done, then we can really easily fall into making some simple mistakes as leaders. So this is all about helping leaders understand what doesn't work for people, that has become popular and best practice, and helping them understand what needs to be done differently to, just update the view of what best practice can be. Okay.
So I think if I think about that, and maybe I can direct this question to you, Levent. I mean, if I think about that, I mean, again, it's quite a complex subject, and I've always said in my retirement I probably will study psychology when I've got the time to do it really, really well. But at the moment, myself, most people in business, most leaders don't have the time to become a trained psychologist. So how much of this is a little knowledge is dangerous versus how much of this is knowing enough that you can change the way that you do change, that you can adapt and be a better leader of change?
Psychology, I think, is a must to learn. And David and I, we have studied psychology after we studied philosophy. For about 15-20 years. We try to understand, as we said, why the people behave the way they do. Why was it important for us? Because in my 35 years of experience, I see the main problem is people-related, culture-related, and behavior-related. Because if people are disengaged and misaligned and they are resisting to change, that affects all the results. And finally, which is a good point, that Gallup, that big famous survey company, has published a report at the end of 2022. They say 70% of people are disengaged. So if 70% of people are disengaged with their work, I think this is something that leaders should be carefully thinking about. So if they are disengaged, they will never be motivated to their best in the world, in their work, and their contribution will be limited. So continuous improvement can be meaningful among those who are engaged which is only 30%. I think this is the reason we need to learn why they behave like this. And the tool was psychology. And psychology is not easy to learn. So you have to learn a lot of concepts, compare them with each other, and try to find their reflections in daily life, which needs a lot of commitment. But the situation has changed approximately a decade ago. What happened is neuroscience gained up some momentum speed and started to prove a lot of things in a very simple way to understand, starting from 2009, for example. And these new information are not reflected yet to business life. This is what we are trying to do. So even you don't know, or you have limited amount of information in psychology, the facts we transfer from neuroscience to business worlds is easy to understand. It makes easier for engineers to construct a model of how brain works and to analyze it, so they can handle behaviors, they can deal with behaviors.
Brilliant. That's really interesting. That's really interesting. I like the way you answered that as well, Levent. You kind of took us through kind of almost your learning cycle on this. So that's really interesting. And obviously somebody with your background, you know, you've probably, and we'll probably come to some examples of that in a few minutes, but there's probably things you wish you'd known then that you know now. And I'm sure you can tell us a couple of stories. So I guess, Edwin, kind of similar question. I'm just going to nuance the question is, you know, as you're coming into this, let's say relatively new, we've adopted the BTFA cycle maybe about 2 years ago, 3 years ago, started to insert at least that way of thinking about don't just focus on the logic, understand what's going on with people, talk to people, understand what's getting in the way of making the changes. We started to do that, and now we're getting more into really helping and working with David and Levent on let's understand what this neuroscience really means for us. Are you seeing that it's starting to change some of your ways of thinking about the world? Is it maybe is it even kind of slaughtering some sacred cows in terms of, let's say, known norms in the business world that maybe aren't that well known now?
Absolutely, and if I connect to what Levent said in his last comments around the model around the learning of the psychology of change, it makes for a without wanting to degrade it, a simplified representation of what it really means, and that makes it accessible. So the BTFA model, and I'm sure we're going to get into more detail around the BTFA model, is what we're currently using. So I don't have to study psychology, just like everyone. I find it really interesting, but I just can't imagine how long it would take for me to really understand it. But understanding the BTFA model is really simple, and it is really helpful. If you take a look at examples of where change worked versus where change didn't work for me, and you apply the BTFA model around, did people really believe? What were they feeling around what needed to happen from a company perspective in terms of change? Did they really believe it was going to make their lives better? And only that realization makes for a completely different view of what you do when you start interacting with teams around where shall we take this improvement, where shall we take this change? And absolutely, it slaughters sacred cows. It makes you really realize the known of I'm here to serve a team, help them go through a change. And it makes you really realize that serving is something completely different than logically explaining what needs to happen. But it's what we very often do. We start with introducing ourselves. This is the goal the company has. This is why it's great for you. Let's go do it. And we skip over all the things that make people realize it's great for them, make them feel and become enthusiastic, and what Levent called be really engaged with the goal of where we need to take it. It's to me better and more explicit in how that works than, for instance, the Golden Circle communication from Simon Sinek, which talks about you need to first start with the belief, the why, the purpose of why we do it. But when you take a look at BTFA, you really go into checking how people feel. really working with people on their emotional level, really understanding what it is that they think. And you can't then just ignore that. Then you have to action those things and realize that if you don't, there's a good chance your change is going to fail. So that's the realization for me. Psychology of change is ultimately important, but the model really makes it tangible for me, workable for me, and actionable for me.
No, that's excellent. I love that. And as you said, this kind of logical approach, it reminds me of working for quite a large global company when we were implementing SAP into a new acquisition. And the original plan was quite good. I mean, it didn't have BTFA or psychology of change, but it had good change management practice in it, where there was a good communication plan and there was a change plan that ran in parallel with a technical plan. And then we became under time pressure because of approvals on capital expenditure, etc., lost some time. And then the project manager decided we didn't have time to do the change management bit. So we were just going to do the technical bit and do it really quickly. And I don't think I need to explain what happened at the end of that project, but it's interesting. And that's the difficulty of doing something that's still a bit abstract, soft, however we want to call it. But we've used the term BTFA, and I've talked briefly about the BTFA model, as has Edwin. But David, you're the creator of the BTFA model. Could you explain a little bit what it is and what it's intended to do?
Let me answer that the opposite way around you've asked it. So what it's intended to do, I guess, is to talk to what you guys have just been talking about. It's to short circuit the learning cycle, because we've read probably, or lost count, but thousands of papers and books and everything else on these esoteric subjects, and recognized that, I was very humbled once by being told I was a pioneer and I was avant-garde and I was leading the way. But the problem I had, which was also came from the same person, was I wanted to take everybody else on the same journey, because I recognized it's the journey that you learn from. And they said that people haven't got 20 years to go and study this stuff, so you've got to do something different. And that's really was those kind of comments coming back to me was the driving force behind thinking this needs to be something simple that people can learn quickly that's still effective. So that the purpose of BTFA is to take that 20-year learning cycle and compress it into a much shorter space of time. And I don't know what that looks like yet. Probably we're hoping a year or two tops in terms of understanding enough about psychology. But we also needed to give somebody or everybody something that's accessible. So we recognized, understanding what we know about brains, how powerful language is, and we had to take and this talks to the theory of bar. So anybody that's lived and breathed lean like we all have, the theory of bar is about putting people together and the whole becoming greater than the sum of its parts when people get to interact, right? And it's not just about the Gemba side of bar, there's a bigger philosophical context to bar. So we thought you have to go to the place where people are at in their minds as much as you have to go to the place where people are at physically. So we knew we had to find a language register that worked for people in the way they speak today, and everybody can know, and they've all got meaning wired into their brains for the words believe, think, feel, and act. So that's like Edwin said earlier. It gives us a door to walk through with people, an access point, and from that we build very carefully. And at what point we introduce the language, then we build it up in the training course.
Yeah, and it's interesting. Again, I think Levent, it'd be good for you to give your perspective on this. Again, as an engineer, I'm an engineer. I grew up with PDCA. I've always applied it, rigorously and vigorously when I do it, and initially, when you're introduced to BTFA, you presume as an engineer, right, it's very logical. Then I go believe, think, feel, act. But actually, it doesn't work like that, does it? It's a much more interactive thing. It's the act that can trigger the feelings, and the feelings that can trigger the belief, etc. So you have to also kind of reprogram your way of thinking in terms of what the BTFA model means, right, Levent? Maybe you could elaborate a bit on that.
Exactly. But for the beginning, if we will use a model, it should be attractive, not so difficult to understand. So we start by explaining easily. So dealing with people. So what we are starting from the change, what we are trying to change is people's behavior, right? So we try to change their behaviors, and if we fail to change their behaviors, we start controlling their behaviors with KPIs, etc., which has disastrous results because it causes stress in their brains. And rather than changing their thoughts, feelings, and beliefs, it makes them stronger because they have to defend their beliefs to survive in the world. This is so simple. So the way we introduce change is very, very important. And in summary, dealing with behaviors is pointless because there are feelings behind behaviors. This is an important point at the start because most of us, the education system taught us we are rational creatures who are making rational decisions to maximize their interests, etc., which is the basics of economics theory, which is something wrong, and we understand it only very recently. Most of the people act with their emotions, so we say behind behaviors, there are not only rational thinking, but also emotions. So the idea that we can leave emotions outside the work is false. And there are many professionals in the world, professional CEOs even, that believes that, which is something false and which is recently proven by neuroscience. This is a part of the proof we are providing in our course. So what is behind feelings then? How can we understand feelings which are too complicated? Behind feelings, there are thoughts. We say thoughts and feelings cannot be separated from each other. They can only coexist. And if you try to change the thoughts of someone else's, it is not easy. It is very difficult indeed, because dealing with thoughts, which is the main reason of the conflict at workplaces, is also pointless, because behind thoughts there are beliefs. So you have to change somebody's beliefs if you want a sustainable change in behavior. Then how to change somebody's beliefs? It is not easy, but if you understand how beliefs are formed in our brain, we can find a way. And it is not difficult. Our beliefs are formed by our experience, according to what we live. So this gives a very simple model to engineers, as Edwin said. Don't deal with behaviors, deal with the environment they are making their experiences, so that you can have a chance to give an opportunity to them to change their beliefs. Of course, after getting this model, and if the participant or person gets this idea and likes this idea, they start learning more about it. And as you said, beliefs, thoughts, and feelings, they work all together all the time, even when we are unconscious. Yeah. This is a very simple, oversimplistic model of the brain. But if people are interested, they can go deeper and deeper. It is an endless area, as you said.
Yeah, no, but it's fantastic, Levent, and again, thank you. Great explanation around that. And what I really like about it is it allows a different kind of dialogue in teams. So just yesterday, I was on a call about some support we're giving in one of our factories, and we talked about all of the logical work that's been done for the past year or so in terms of how we should redesign the value stream and how we can get rates up and be more effective. And the conclusion was that the work done is already great. You know, there's nothing logically that needs to be done anymore. It really is. And the language people were using, you know, it was one of my team members said, it's just the BTFA hasn't been there. And they started talking about how do we get the BTFA there? How do we get the belief in this being the right thing to do and to change well-established ways of working, and a belief, you know, without going into details, a belief that you've just got to keep the machines running, so we've got to keep packing inventory behind them. And if we've got a machine that's working, let's make stuff on it, regardless of whether there's flow in the value stream. So changing that belief, as you say, Levent, through actions, through experiences, is where they're starting to focus the change on, because they don't need to do any more analysis. They don't need to do any more logic. But it's just beautiful to hear people starting, fundamentally engineers starting to talk about BTFA and how do we inject the the BTFA into what we're doing, and that must be really nice for you to hear, David, as well. So,
if you could see, you could probably see the hair standing up on my arms, because that's really good. I really love that.
Yeah, the goosebumps are
definitely.
But anyway, listen, we always about when we're about halfway through, we always do a bit of a fun fact about yourself. I'm not going to ask Edwin again. If anybody wants to hear, we've had some fun with his fun facts in previous episodes. But David, tell me a little bit about yourself in terms of a fun fact. What might people not know about you?
Well, do you know what? I'm going to link it to what we just said, because it's in a particular experience in a factory in Essex, where I was watching consultants come in, and all the people there who had an incredible tacit, intuitive knowledge of the business and how it ran and functioned, completely being railroaded by other people that came in and said, this is how you do change, this is what you're going to change to, and not having a good BTFA experience, because they were getting despondent and depressed. And I was tasked at that point in time, very early on in my lean understanding of world-class manufacturing, as it still was then. Lean hadn't been invented at that point. So I was told I had to go and train 5S to a French team. And I was thinking, oh my goodness, I've got to stand at the front of a room, and I've got to stand up and be a trainer. And, I had no clue what I was going to do. So and this probably gives you a bit of a clue as to the fact that I might think a bit differently. I thought, who's the best people at controlling an audience, at capturing attention? I thought, well, it's comedians, it's actors. So I went down to London on a Sunday, paid 40 quid, and put myself on an improvisational comedy course, just to try and give myself a chance of being able to stand in front of people and do some training. I was terrible. These poor people from France must have been bored to tears for 2 days listening to me talk about 5S, but it gave me enough confidence to at least stand up the front of the room in the first place. So yeah, when I thought about becoming a trainer, I went to go and see some actors and put myself on an improvisational comedy course. So I thought,
that's brilliant. That's brilliant. I've never heard of somebody doing that before, but it actually makes a lot of sense. So it's good. Brilliant. Thanks, David. And Levent, what about yourself? Fun fact about yourself?
From my perspective, of course, other people may find other fun facts about me, but I always remember a single point in my life when I think about fun fact. Which was the time when I left Toyota and decided to move to another automotive OEM. See, after 16 years in Toyota, being trained in Toyota Japan, and having chance to apply Toyota production system, not only in production, but also quality engineering and purchasing, and having very good relationships with top management in Japan, I was sure that I was number one, or if not number two of TPS or lean in the world. With that confidence, I said, okay, I learned everything and I should implement it in other companies now, and I left Toyota. But that was a very, very big shock for me. That was the time I felt like a fish who jumped outside of an aquarium. What I realized was the importance of culture, because my knowledge didn't work. At least 80% of them didn't work. That was the time I questioned my decision. Time to time, I still question that decision. And that was the time I understood the importance of engagement. First of all, at that time, I called it culture. But now, after 35 years, I call it engagement. Because knowledge doesn't work if you cannot engage with people. Everything is about people.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's beautiful event. It makes me think, and it's translated from the Dutch. It's an old Dutch saying, which is a ship is safest when it's in the harbour, but the ship wasn't designed to be in the harbour. And you obviously were built by Toyota, but you weren't designed to stay in that safe harbour of Toyota. Yes. So you had to sail out into the rough seas and experience them.
Exactly, yes.
To be the best that you are. So that's a beautiful story. Thank you, Levent. So okay, so let's talk a bit more about experiences of change programs. So I'm gonna put you on the spot here, Edwin. So give me an example of the worst and the best change programs you've been involved in, and how you think the psychology of change, BTFA, has impacted both of them.
How about I give an example by only talking about one Six Sigma project? Okay. It was a situation where we had a production line for energy saving lamps, and we embarked on a Six Sigma project because when we set it up, when we switched over to a different type, it either worked or it didn't work. There was nothing in between. So it failed completely. It wouldn't run. It would only produce defects, or everything was perfect. And we went to it very logically. So we started documenting everything that had to do with setup of the machine, all the parameters for all the flames that we used and the heating equipment that we used, and we put flow gauges and everything in place, and it was all dramatically not helping. And everybody lost confidence in what we know to be a scientifically proven, brilliant problem-solving method. And mood was really, really down. And in the end, we gave up. We basically said, it's never going to work. We won't understand it. And the emotional state of the people on the shop floor was terrible. And we decided to actually stop the production of that particular lamp in that factory. And whilst we were at it, at the very back end of that project, and we kept working with the team because we had bonded as a team, and we said, we'll be part of the problem until the end. I was in an evening shift, and I spoke to one of the guys on the shop floor, and he said, if only I could see the back end of the line, because that's where we produce all the defects. And I said, what do you mean, if only I could see? Because the lamp goes in here, there's nothing you can see, and then it comes there out of the oven, and that's where you have your defect. He said, well, I've asked 1,000,000 times for having a simple webcam to be put at the back end of the machine, but we don't seem to have a budget. That was terrible, and I was shocked. And what I did is I went to the local store and for 30 euros bought a webcam. And we set it up, and we felt like we were pioneers. We were beating the system and whatnot, even though we didn't have any expectations of the outcome of that particular webcam. And we didn't have any outcome of that particular webcam, but it boosted the engagement of the team tremendously. And in the next evening shift, we talked about how do we really, if we really would do it all again, what would we do first? Where would we start? And we asked one of the maintenance guys to come and help us do a changeover where a changeover wasn't needed. We had a running machine and it worked well at that point in time. We said, all right, stop the machine, change over to the same type. And I observed him and I thought he's doing something really strange with measuring a distance of a very flimsy coil to where it's supposed to have a distance very accurately defined to the base that it's mounted to. And I asked him, could you teach me that? Could you give me some job instructions so I can understand what that measurement system looks like? And together we found out that it actually isn't repeatable at all. If you redo it and redo it and redo it, we couldn't reproduce the same number. And we decided to just flip it over, put it on a stable underground, and measure it that way. So we at least had a stable situation. With that, we were able to do the changeover, and the machine worked. All right, we said, let's do it again. So we did a full night shift of changeovers, and we never failed. So by going in from the state of total despair and having to run the final runs of the machine and just doing something stupid that we said we'll beat the system with, we boosted morale, we got new energy, and we worked like crazy. We found something in the measurement system, and all of a sudden, the actual logic also still made sense. And we could do a Six Sigma project on the measurement system in 3 days. And we made the line work. And it was predictable, it was perfect. And if you take a look at this from a BTFA perspective, it was just the stamina of seeing it through that needed a boost. We'd lost the belief. We were thinking we were never going to be there. We were feeling awkward. And then just changing that feeling of awkwardness gave us new energy. We said, all right, it's not going to happen to us. We're better than this situation. We got the energy in there and we cracked the nut. The back end of, unfortunately, a line that 2 weeks later had to stop.
That's brilliant though, Edwin. And what I love about that, I mean, again, it highlights, because from a completely logical perspective, you wasted €30 in your time on buying a webcam. But from the emotional, the BTFA perspective, you re-injected belief and morale into a team that then allowed you to find the right way. So that's brilliant. I love it. I love it. And the other thing I love is whilst you're telling that, because, and for people who are listening, you won't see this, but if you're watching this on YouTube, you can see that because Edwin has blurred out the background on his camera, as he moves, as he's talking, he gets a green Flora wig as he's talking, which is quite amusing to watch as well whilst he's telling this great story. Brilliant. So David, what was happening in the brains of those people in the story that Edwin's talked about? What's happening in our brains when we experience change?
Wow, I'll probably have to get a bit technical with this answer. I guess the brain's designed to change constantly. Okay, what it normally does is reinforce what we already know, because that's what's kept us safe in the world. So that's our default ways of behaving get checked for and verified each day based on the sensory stimulus the brain receives through our nervous systems, and it says, is this still working for me? Yes, it is. Great. We'll keep these neurons and all the bits and pieces in the brain that make up our brain structure nice and strong and robust. And when we have to do something differently, that, first of all, this is where you get into the psychology. If you've got very high levels of confidence, you might see a problem as a challenge. If you've got low levels of self-confidence, you might see problems as a personal threat or attack. So you then have got to, that influences the way the brain changes, because like we said earlier, thoughts and feelings can't be separated. So the chemicals released that are involved in change, as well as the neurotransmitters in the brain, which engage different parts of the brain, will kick in and function differently for somebody with low confidence compared to somebody with high confidence being presented with the same problem. So there's the first differentiator, where we have to understand our people and know to understand what they're going to, how they might respond and react to things. But fundamentally, when you get despondent, you release chemicals that, or you utilize chemicals in the brain to pass on signals that we associate, broadly speaking, to negative emotions. So that those despondency, that despair that you were talking about, those are words, colloquial words we use to describe emotional states, which when you start thinking about them as chemical states, chemical mix in your brain, it makes it so much easier to understand, because you can then think, what have I got to do to adjust this chemical mix to get back onto the positive side of things? So, and then obviously when you get a breakthrough, when there's an outcome objective, like a target that people actually, and going back to Levent's keyword here, engage with, and people can identify with, if they feel like they're making progress towards that, and what happens is that you get a sense of success, a sense of happiness. So what that means is the chemicals associated to positive emotions are released in your brain. So you might go from having high levels of cortisol, which is associated to stress, it's a stressor hormone, a glucocorticoid, and you might swap that across in what your brain's doing to be a dopamine or oxytocin release, because you identify with the people, so you get a bonding response, which is a nice feeling, and you get a success-based response, a reward mechanism cuts in your brain to release chemicals that make you feel good about yourself. So that's what's going on in the brain. When we have these environments where people are challenged and challenge turns to stress, people start shutting down. It changes the way the glucose energy moves in the brain and highlights different parts of the brain that are more to do with defensive and away from responses. So people start to not engage and not be open to new ideas. And when you start getting some success and you get that chemical shift in the brain, and people can enjoy moving forward together and bonding and all the good things that come from great teamwork. So there's a lot going on in the brain. Philip, is the answer to your question?
Yeah. Absolutely. No, that's great. And again, we said we were going to keep this light in terms of the science, but I would encourage anybody. We're using the BTFA model. We're learning more about the psychology of change from David and Levent, and in GK and Aerospace, and the listeners from our company. Please, get engaged in what we're doing, because it's fantastic. People outside GK and Aerospace who want to learn more about it, please make sure that you're You're connecting with the BTFA model through, ducks in a row and the work that David and Levent are doing, because it's fantastic. You will really learn something positive. So we're really close to the end now. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to ask Levent to, help to close us off with some advice to new learners of the subject. People who aren't trained psychologists, who are leaders, but have listened to this and say, hey, I really want to do this. I want to learn about this. Levent, what would be your advice?
Yeah, this is the question I'm thinking over for about 30 years as of now. This is what we have been trying to do together with David, and we have created BTFA. And thanks to your support and other people's support, BTFA is evolving day by day to be a more simple, more scientific model that everybody can use. So we strongly recommend them to learn BTFA. And they will see that from the first day on, they will be able to elaborate human behavior and why is behind that behavior, interestingly, in an engineering way. So PDCA still is valid. Our strong PDCA skills will help them to understand BTFA. Because, although human behavior seems random, according to David and me, it's not. And interestingly, brain follows the principles of causality very strongly. Of course, there are things like unconscious thoughts, instincts, etc., that we have limited access to, and also feelings which are difficult to describe. But still, this mechanism, this model follows the principle of causality, which gives engineers a very good, strength or capability. Perhaps an engineer with strong BTFA skills can understand some psychological things better than a psychologist do in the near future.
Brilliant. I love that. I love that. So listen, it's been an absolute pleasure having this discussion. It's been really fantastic to have David and Levent on the show, and of course, as always, Edwin, I always value your sage advice and your sage input. So thank you. I hope the listeners really enjoyed it. We will put some links up about how you can connect better with this in the podcast and the videocast. So it just remains for me to say, remember, this is about changing how you lead, not who you are.